On the morning of May 19th, 1780, the people of New England woke up to an ordinary Friday. Farmers in Connecticut walked out to their fields. Soldiers in the Continental Army ate their breakfast rations. Fishermen on the Massachusetts coast prepared their nets. The American Revolution was still grinding forward in its fifth year. The British held New York. Washington's army was stretched thin. Nobody was thinking about the sky. By mid-morning, something was wrong. A yellow tint crept across the horizon from the southwest. By 11 o'clock, that yellow had deepened to copper, then to a bruised orange, then to something that had no name in the vocabulary of anyone alive. By noon, across the entire region of New England, from southern Connecticut to the coast of Maine, the sky had gone black, not overcast, not stormy, black. The stars were visible in the middle of the day. Candles had to be lit at noon. Chickens went to their roosts. Frogs began to sing as if night had fallen. Cows returned to their barns. And thousands of people, already living under the psychological weight of a war that had dragged on for 5 years with no certain end, concluded that the world was ending. It was not the end of the world. But what it was 245 years later is still officially listed in multiple historical and scientific records as unexplained. Not solved, not closed, unexplained. That single word, applied to an event witnessed by tens of thousands of people across hundreds of miles, is what makes this story worth examining. Because the dark day of 1780 is not just a curiosity from colonial history. It is a case study in what happens when a civilization encounters something it cannot process, how it responds in the immediate moment, how official institutions manage that response, and what the long tail of an unexplained mass event does to the societies that lived through it, including economically, including politically, including in ways that reach forward far further than most historians acknowledge. Let us start with what actually happened that day, as precisely as the record allows. The darkness arrived from the southwest. Every contemporary account agrees on this. It did not descend from directly above like a cloud cover. It moved, it had a direction. Samuel Tenney, a physician in Exeter, New Hampshire, kept meticulous notes throughout the day and wrote afterward that the air carried an unusual smell, something between sulphur and damp wood smoke that became noticeable as the darkness intensified. Multiple accounts from Massachusetts described a greasy quality to the air, a film that settled on surfaces exposed to the outside. Several observers noted that rain fell during the darkest period and that the rain itself was discoloured, leaving a residue that one diarist described as resembling soot mixed with ash. The darkness reached its peak around noon and persisted in its most intense form for approximately 2 to 3 hours. By mid-afternoon, a faint sickly light had returned, not normal daylight, but a dim reddish glow that witnesses consistently described as unlike anything they had experienced. That evening the moon rose red, not the reddish tinge of a harvest moon. Observers wrote of a moon the colour of blood, and so dark that it cast no shadow and provided no useful light. The following day, May 20th, returned to normal conditions with no atmospheric abnormality reported. The geographic extent of the event was vast. Confirmed reports placed the darkness across Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, and into what is now Maine. Some accounts suggest the darkness was also observed in parts of New York and New Jersey, though the intensity diminished with distance from the New England core. The total affected area covered hundreds of thousands of square miles. The scientific explanations that have been proposed over the years are worth examining carefully, because each one reveals something about the limits of what the historical record can definitively establish. The most widely cited modern explanation is wildfire smoke from a combination of large forest fires burning in Ontario and possibly in the northern New England interior. This explanation was advanced most prominently by a research team in the early 21st century and received considerable media attention. The argument rests on the known meteorological mechanics of how dense smoke from large-scale wildfires can be transported by upper-level winds over enormous distances, and can, under the right conditions of atmospheric layering, block sufficient sunlight to create dramatic darkening effects at ground level. The 1780 dark day, in this theory, was essentially an extreme version of the haze events that occasionally affect cities downwind of major forest fires today. This explanation is plausible. It is not proven. The critical weakness is the absence of direct contemporary documentation of fires large enough in the right location to produce the scale of effect recorded. The researchers who advanced the wildfire theory relied on inference, on knowledge of general fire patterns for the period, on tree ring records suggesting unusual burning activity, and on the directional reports of the darkness moving from southwest to northeast. These are suggestive. They do not constitute a closed case. The historical record does not contain a contemporaneous report from a credible source in Ontario or northern New England describing fires large and widespread enough to account for what New England experienced. Other explanations have included volcanic activity. The late 18th century was a period of significant volcanic forcing on global climate. Trilaki in Iceland erupted in 1783, 3 years after the Dark Day, and produced well-documented atmospheric effects across the northern hemisphere. The question of whether an earlier eruption, potentially from a less well-documented volcanic source, could have contributed to the 1780 event has been raised but not resolved. The atmospheric chemistry implied by the sulphurous smell reported by multiple witnesses is at least consistent with a volcanic contribution, though it is also consistent with smoke from certain types of organic material burning under low oxygen conditions. There is a third category of explanation that mainstream scientific literature treats with skepticism but that surfaces repeatedly in serious historical analysis: the possible role of a significant meteorite airburst somewhere in the North American interior. Such an event would produce an immediate release of dust, smoke, and vaporized material capable of spreading rapidly across a wide atmospheric column. The evidence is thin. There is no confirmed impact site associated with 1780. But the absence of a confirmed site is partly a function of the fact that nobody was systematically looking with the right tools for most of the intervening centuries. The reddened moon, the greasy residue, the sulphurous smell, the extreme rapidity of onset, these are features a large airburst would produce. They are also features a sufficiently large wildfire or volcanic event would produce. The record does not discriminate cleanly between these possibilities. What the scientific uncertainty means is that the event remains genuinely open, not in a conspiratorial sense, not because anyone is hiding anything, but because the documentation of the period, impressive as it is by the standards of pre-industrial record keeping, does not contain enough quantitative atmospheric data to run the backward calculations that would definitively close any of the proposed explanations. This matters beyond academic tidiness because the uncertainty has a direct bearing on how the event was processed politically and economically in its immediate aftermath. Consider the political context with precision. May 19, 1780 fell in the 5th year of the American Revolution. The Continental Army was in serious difficulty. The previous winter at Morristown, New Jersey had been the worst of the war, more brutal than Valley Forge by most measures, with soldiers dying of cold and starvation in conditions that pushed multiple units to the edge of mutiny. In May 1780, the news from the south was catastrophic. British forces under Lord Cornwallis had just captured Charleston, South Carolina, the largest city in the south, in one of the most significant British victories of the entire war. Over 5,000 Continental soldiers had been captured. The Southern Continental Army had essentially ceased to exist as a fighting force. The civilian population of New England in May 1780 was not a population in a state of confident revolutionary optimism. It was a population that had been at war for 5 years, had endured serious economic hardship, had watched friends and family members die, and had seen the revolutionary cause come closer to collapse than official histories typically acknowledge. The psychological resilience of the population was not inexhaustible. It had been drawn down significantly. Into this context, at noon on May 19th, the sky went black. The religious response was immediate and intense. New England in 1780 was not the secularizing, Enlightenment-influenced world that the founders of the Republic are often portrayed as inhabiting. The ordinary people of rural Connecticut and Massachusetts lived in a world saturated with biblical literalism and the active expectation of divine intervention in human affairs. For these people, a sky that went black at noon was not a meteorological curiosity. It was revelation. It was the sixth seal. It was the moment that every preacher had described and every congregation had contemplated in the abstract, now manifesting in concrete, terrifying reality outside their windows. The Connecticut state legislature was in session that day. When the darkness peaked around noon, meant the chamber was plunged into a twilight so deep that candles had to be brought in to continue proceedings. Multiple members moved to adjourn. The argument was explicit. If this was the day of judgment, the legislature should not be conducting ordinary business. It should adjourn so that members could be with their families and make their peace with God. What happened next has become one of the most cited moments in American civic history, though it is rarely discussed in the economic context where it belongs. Colonel Abraham Davenport, a member of the Connecticut legislature from Stamford, rose in opposition to adjournment. His argument, recorded in multiple contemporary accounts and later immortalized in a poem by John Greenleaf Whittier, was this: "If this is the day of judgment, then I wish to be found doing my duty. I move that candles be brought and that we proceed." The legislature did not adjourn. It brought candles and continued its work. This moment is usually told as a story of individual courage and civic virtue, which it was, but it is also something else. It is a data point in the economic history of the event, because the question of whether to continue functioning or to collapse into apocalyptic paralysis was not merely a question of personal faith. It was a question with direct economic consequences that played out across New England at every level of commercial and agricultural life simultaneously. While the legislature was debating adjournment in Hartford, farmers across the region were making individual decisions that collectively constituted a massive economic event. Do you harvest the crops you would plan to harvest today? Or do you believe it is the last day and the harvest does not matter? Do you honour the commercial contracts that were scheduled for today, the debts that were due, the transactions that were planned? Do you continue to operate your mill, your tannery, your printing press, your shop? Or do you conclude that the normal mechanisms of economic life have been suspended by divine intervention? The evidence from diaries, letters, and account books of the period suggests that the economic disruption of May 19, 1780 was substantial. The day's commerce effectively stopped across much of the region. Accounts describe markets emptying, shops closing, workers leaving their positions to return to their families. Some of this was rational risk management. In the near total darkness, outdoor agricultural work was genuinely impossible, and many forms of indoor work requiring good light was severely impaired. But the record also reflects something beyond simple practical necessity. People were not just unable to work. A significant portion of them were choosing not to work because they believed working was irrelevant. The economic impact compounded across subsequent days in ways that the historical record tracks imperfectly but suggestively. There is evidence of a short but sharp disruption to credit markets in Connecticut and Massachusetts in the weeks following the dark day. The mechanism is not mysterious. When a significant portion of the population believes, even briefly, that they may have been living through the end times, the psychological relationship to debt changes. A debt owed in a world that might be ending is not the same instrument as a debt owed in a world with a reliably continuing future. Some creditors accelerated collection. Some debtors used the moment of uncertainty to renegotiate terms. Some transactions that had been in progress simply stalled as counterparties reassessed. The disruption to agricultural planning was potentially more significant and has been even less studied. May is a critical month in the New England agricultural calendar. Planting decisions made in May determine the fall harvest. The dark day fell at exactly the point in the agricultural cycle when farmers were making those decisions, and the evidence suggests that the event contributed to a measurable disruption in planting patterns in 1780 that fed into supply problems in the following months. This is difficult to isolate causally because 1780 was also an unusually difficult year for other reasons related to the war. But the correlation between the dark day and subsequent agricultural shortfalls in the affected region is real. The political economy of the event extended beyond immediate market disruption. The dark day accelerated a pre-existing debate within New England political culture about the relationship between divine providence and the revolutionary cause. This debate had enormous practical implications for everything from military recruitment to tax collection. One faction, represented by figures like the Reverend Timothy Dwight and various associates in the network of Calvinist clergy that still held enormous influence over New England public life, argued that the Dark Day was a divine warning, that God was signalling displeasure with some aspect of how the revolution was being conducted. Specifically, this faction pointed to what they described as the moral collapse of wartime society: profiteering, Sabbath breaking, the influence of French Enlightenment ideas that they considered atheistic, and the weakening of traditional social hierarchies. For this faction, the correct economic response to the Dark Day was not business as usual. It was repentance, moral reform, and a return to the kind of disciplined, religiously grounded commercial and agricultural practice that they associated with New England's founding generation. The opposing faction, represented more by merchant class figures and by those in the revolutionary leadership who had more explicitly Enlightenment-influenced worldviews, argued that the Dark Day had a natural explanation that would eventually be identified, and that the correct response was exactly what Colonel Davenport had demonstrated. Keep the candles burning, keep doing your work. Do not allow a natural atmospheric event, however dramatic, to disrupt the functioning of a society in the middle of an existential struggle for its own survival. This was not merely a theological argument, it was an argument about the economic philosophy of the Republic being born. The Calvinist position implied an economy governed by moral prerequisites, in which commercial activity was legitimate only when conducted by people in right relationship with divine authority. The Enlightenment position implied an economy governed by rational self-interest within secular legal frameworks, yet in which commercial activity was legitimate regardless of the theological state of the participants. This argument, which the Dark Day catalyzed and intensified, runs directly into the debates that shaped the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The fault lines between Hamiltonian commercialism and Jeffersonian agrarianism had many sources. The Dark Day was one of them, not the most important, but a significant one, almost entirely absent from the economic historiography of the founding period. The event's long-term influence on New England religious culture is better documented, though even here the economic implications have been underplayed. The Dark Day contributed to a wave of revivalist religious activity in New England in the early 1780s that fed directly into the Second Great Awakening later in the decade and into the 1790s. This revivalist wave had profound economic consequences because it changed the labour patterns, the consumption patterns, and the savings behaviour of a significant portion of the New England population in ways that shaped the region's early industrialization trajectory. Specifically, the communities most intensely affected by the revivalist response to the Dark Day were also among the communities most receptive to the message of temperance, frugality, and disciplined labour that evangelical Christianity preached. These were the same communities that provided much of the workforce for the first New England textile mills in the 1790s and early 1800s. The moral economy of early New England industrialization, its emphasis on supervised labour, on the mill town as a controlled moral environment, Chaxos on the paternalistic relationship between factory owner and factory worker, drew on a cultural vocabulary that the revivalist wave of the early 1780s had helped create. And that wave had been catalysed in part by the terror and the subsequent religious reckoning of May 19th, 1780. This is the kind of causal chain that revisionist economic history is designed to trace. Not the grand narrative of inevitable industrial progress, driven by capital accumulation and technological innovation, but the specific contingent, humanly particular sequence of events through which a civilization arrives at an economic structure that then presents itself as natural and inevitable. The Dark Day did not cause the Industrial Revolution, but it was a thread in the fabric of consciousness out of which New England's early industrial culture was woven. There is one more dimension that has received almost no scholarly attention. The Dark Day of 1780 was not the only anomalous atmospheric event that New England experienced in the late 18th century. The period from roughly 1775 to 1800 was characterized by a series of unusual climatic events across the Northern Hemisphere. The brutal winters of the Revolution, the dry fog summer of 1783 following the Lackey eruption, the dimmed sun of 1784, and the year without a summer in 1816. This cluster constitutes what climate historians call a period of enhanced volcanic and atmospheric forcing, a time when the normal range of year-to-year weather variability was widened significantly by external factors. The economic history of the early American Republic has been written almost entirely without reference to this climatic context. Most standard narratives focus on political institutions, on debt and currency, on trade policy, on the dynamics of slavery and free labor. The possibility that significant agricultural and commercial volatility in the 1780s and 1790s was driven partly by climatic disruption, rather than policy choices alone, has been largely ignored. The dark day of 1780 sits at the intersection of all these threads. It was an atmospheric event with a still uncertain cause. It occurred at a moment of maximum political and psychological vulnerability for a society at war. It triggered immediate economic disruption through market paralysis and agricultural interference. It accelerated cultural and theological debates with direct implications for economic philosophy. And it contributed to a revivalist wave that shaped the labor culture of early American industrialization. None of this makes May 19, 1780 the hidden key to American economic history. It does make it considerably more than a curiosity. The official listing as unexplained in scientific terms is accurate, but unexplained atmospherically is not the same as unexplained historically. Historically, the dark day's consequences are traceable. They moved through New England society like the darkness itself moved from southwest to northeast, touching everything, leaving a residue still affecting the shape of American economic life decades later. Imagine standing in a Connecticut farmyard at noon on May 19, 1780. The sky above you is darker than any night you have ever seen, because at night there are stars, and today there are no stars. Prior to only blackness and a smell you cannot identify, and a silence from the birds that feels wrong in a way your body recognizes before your mind does. You do not know what is happening. Nobody around you knows what is happening. The most educated person within 20 miles does not know what is happening. The most powerful government in the Atlantic world does not know what is happening. What do you do? That question is not just a thought experiment. It is the question that every person in New England answered individually on that day, and the aggregate of their answers constituted an economic event, a political event, and a cultural event whose consequences were still playing out when the last person who remembered the day finally died, sometime in the 1850s, in an America that had already begun to forget what that sky had looked like. The darkness lasted a few hours. The questions it left behind lasted much longer. 245 years later, the official answer to what caused the sky to go black at noon across all of New England is still, we do not know for certain. That uncertainty is not a failure of science. It is an honest acknowledgement that the past does not always yield its secrets completely, even when the record is rich and the researchers are diligent. What we can know, and what the economic and cultural history of the period confirms, is that the event was real, that it was terrifying, that it changed things, and that the changes it set in motion are still, if you know where to look, faintly visible in the structure of American economic and religious life today. The sky went black at noon, the candles were lit, the work continued. And nothing was quite the same afterward. If this kind of deep historical analysis is what you came here for, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We go where the standard history books do not, into the events and the consequences that get left out of the official story. See you in the next one.